The encounter. The crash was violent. Smoke billowed from the wreckage of Lieutenant Jason Carr's fighter, its one sleek hull now a mangled skeleton of metal and flames. He stumbled from the cockpit, coughing against the acrid stench of burning circuits and scorched earth. Around him, the alien forest loomed, its towering bioluminescent trees casting an eerie green glow over the scene. Jason gripped his emergency kit tightly, scanning for threats with the well-honed instincts of a veteran pilot. His squadron was gone. Ambushed by a Krovic fleet, they'd been scattered across this uncharted sector. Jason's comms had gone dead mid-fight, leaving him stranded and alone. Still, he clung to a shred of hope, the emergency beacon strapped to his wrist. If he could fix it, he might still call for help, assuming the Krovic didn't find him first. A rustle in the underbrush snapped Jason's attention to the left. He dropped into a crouch, his pulse quickening as he drew his sidearm. The noise grew louder, deliberate. Someone was approaching. Human, a voice called, smooth yet edged with authority. Drop your weapon. Jason froze. The voice carried the unmistakable accent of the Krovic, an alien race humanity had been at war with for years. His grip on the sidearm tightened, but he didn't fire. Slowly, he turned his head toward the source. She stepped out from the shadows, a striking figure draped in sleek black armor that shimmered like liquid obsidian. Her skin, an iridescent green, seemed to absorb the faint light of the forest, and her golden eyes glowed with an intensity that pinned Jason in place. She held a plasma rifle aimed at his chest, her expression calm but unreadable. "You're Krovic," Jason said, his voice steady despite the weapon trained on him. "And you're human," she replied, her lips curving into the faintest hint of a smirk. "I'd say we're both stating the obvious." Jason studied her, noting the insignia on her armor. She was high-ranking, perhaps even an elite. He was outmatched, outgunned, and injured. Yet, he refused to show weakness. "Why haven't you shot me yet?" he asked, his tone sharper than intended. Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something Jason couldn't identify. Curiosity, perhaps. She lowered her rifle slightly but kept it ready. "Your kind is fascinating," she said. "I was told humans were brutal and savage, yet here you stand, calm, unafraid. Are you not aware that I could kill you in an instant?" Jason allowed himself a bitter laugh. "Oh, I'm aware. But I've faced worse than death, and if you wanted me dead, I'd already be a smoking crater." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she gestured toward the beacon on his wrist. "What's that?" Jason hesitated. "It's broken. Not much use to either of us." She tilted her head, studying him like a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "I could take you prisoner," she said, almost to herself. "But something tells me you'd find a way to make that more trouble than it's worth." Jason shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Probably. We humans have a habit of being inconvenient." The Krovic commander lowered her rifle completely, though she didn't holster it. "What's your name, human?" "Lieutenant Jason Carr," he said, eyeing her warily. "And you are?" "Commander Lariah of the Krovic Vanguard," she replied. Her voice softened slightly, though her posture remained guarded. "You're far from home, Lieutenant. Why fight a war that isn't yours?" Jason's jaw tightened. "Because it is ours. The Krovic didn't give us much choice when they started slaughtering colonies. And maybe I fight because I believe we're worth defending." For a moment, Lariah seemed taken aback. She studied him intently, as though searching for a crack in his resolve. What she saw must have surprised her because the corners of her mouth lifted ever so slightly. "Fascinating," she said again, more quietly this time. "You're unlike any human I've met." Jason allowed himself a small, grim smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." A sudden crack of distant gunfire shattered the tenuous moment of calm. Both Jason and Lariah turned toward the sound. Her golden eyes flicked back to him, and for a fleeting second, Jason thought he saw hesitation. "You're injured," she said finally, her gaze dropping to the blood staining his sleeve. "You won't survive long out here." "Then help me," Jason said, his voice bold despite the odds. "Or shoot me. Either way, make a choice." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and Jason braced himself for the worst. Instead, Lariah reached into her belt and pulled out a small device. Tossing it to him, she said, "A temporary truce. But if you try anything—" "I won't," Jason interrupted, catching the device. "I have more important things to worry about." Lariah's expression remained unreadable, but she nodded. "Follow me, human. If you want to survive, you'll need more than just luck." Jason hesitated for only a moment before falling in step behind her. His instincts screamed at him to keep his guard up, but a small, unyielding part of him, his gut, whispered that this alien might be his best chance. As they disappeared into the bioluminescent forest, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could yet understand. A fragile alliance. The alien forest grew darker as Jason followed Lariah through its dense underbrush. Bioluminescent fungi lit their path, casting an eerie glow on the ground. Strange calls echoed through the trees, some sounding close, others distant, but all unfamiliar. Jason's hand hovered near his sidearm, though he doubted it would do much against whatever predators lurked here. Lariah walked with effortless grace, her obsidian armor blending into the shadows. She glanced back occasionally, her golden eyes sharp and assessing. Despite the tension between them, Jason noticed how differently she moved compared to human soldiers, fluid and deliberate, as though she belonged to the forest itself. "How far are we going?" Jason asked, breaking the silence. "There's a cave ahead," Lariah replied without turning. "It'll provide cover for the night. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to sleep in the open with the predators." Jason smirked. "Tempting, but I'll pass." Her lips twitched in what might have been amusement, but she said nothing more. Jason pressed on, his injuries reminding him of their presence with every step. The makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around his arm was soaked through, and a dull throb pulsed in his side. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep up the pace. Finally, they reached the cave, a jagged hollow carved into a massive rock formation. The entrance was partially obscured by thick vines, and Lariah used a small blade to slice through them. Once inside, she activated a handheld light that bathed the cavern in a soft, white glow. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing to a flat rock near the wall. Jason complied, leaning heavily against the cool stone. He watched as Lariah rummaged through a compartment on her armor, pulling out a small medical kit. "You're going to patch me up?" he asked, arching a brow. "Unless you'd prefer to bleed out," she said, kneeling beside him. Her tone was matter-of-fact, but there was no malice in it. "Hold still." Jason did as she instructed, wincing as she peeled back the blood-soaked bandage. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her hands steady as she worked to clean and seal the wound with a strange, greenish salve. The pain subsided almost immediately, replaced by a cooling sensation. "What is that stuff?" he asked, eyeing the salve. "A Kravic biogel," she replied. "It accelerates healing and numbs pain. Consider it a gesture of good faith." "Good faith, huh?" Jason leaned back, studying her. "Why are you helping me, really? You don't seem like the type to go soft on an enemy." Lariah paused, her gaze flicking up to meet his. "I haven't decided what you are yet, Lieutenant." Jason frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," she hesitated, as though searching for the right words. "You're not what I expected. I've fought humans before, seen the destruction your kind leaves in its wake. But you're different." Jason let out a dry laugh. "That's funny. I was going to say the same about you." Lariah tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. "Explain." "Well," Jason began, gesturing vaguely, you haven't killed me yet, for starters. And you're not barking orders or spouting propaganda about Kravik's superiority. You seem curious. She straightened, a hint of defensiveness creeping into her posture. Curiosity isn't a weakness. I didn't say it was, Jason replied. It's just not what I expected from someone in your position. Laraya's expression softened, though her guard didn't drop entirely. The Kravik are taught to view humans as reckless and barbaric, a threat to be eliminated. But you speak of loyalty, sacrifice, and hope. It's unsettling. Jason leaned forward slightly, wincing as his side protested the movement. Maybe that's because you've been told the wrong story. Humans aren't perfect, but we're more than just soldiers. We fight because we have something worth fighting for. For a moment, Laraya didn't respond. She seemed to be weighing his words, her gaze distant. Finally, she said, your kind values emotion more than logic. It's a dangerous way to live. Maybe, Jason admitted. But it's also what makes us human. They sat in silence for a while, the hum of distant creatures filling the cavern. Jason could feel the tension between them shifting, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't sure if it was trust, understanding, or something else entirely, but it was enough to make him believe this alliance, fragile as it was, might hold. You're an enigma, Lieutenant, Laraya said at last, standing and moving toward the cave entrance. She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Get some rest. You'll need your strength. Jason watched her disappear into the shadows outside, her silhouette blending into the night. He leaned back against the rock, exhaustion finally catching up with him. As his eyes drifted shut, one thought lingered in his mind. He wasn't sure what kind of game Laraya was playing, but he had a feeling this was only the beginning. Growing connections. Jason woke to the soft glow of morning light filtering through the vines at the cave entrance. The sounds of the alien forest, a symphony of chirps and hums, were now less threatening, though the sense of danger had not entirely faded. He shifted, testing the arm Laraya had treated the night before. The pain was gone, and though his movements were stiff, the wound seemed to have already begun healing. Laraya was outside, her silhouette framed by the light. She stood at the edge of a stream that ran past the cave, her armor gleaming faintly in the early sun. Jason rose, careful not to make too much noise. His boots crunched against loose pebbles, and she turned her head slightly, acknowledging his presence without fully facing him. You move like a herd beast, she remarked dryly. Jason chuckled. Well, good morning to you too. She remained silent, her gaze fixed on the water. Jason hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt her contemplation, but the tension between them had softened enough that he decided to take the chance. He stepped closer, standing beside her as the stream babbled quietly. What's the plan? He asked after a moment. Laraya sighed, her golden eyes darting toward him. The Kravik will be searching for you, and for me now, too. The further we travel, the harder it will be for them to track us. Jason frowned. Why would they come after you? You're one of them. Her jaw tightened. Not anymore. The weight of her words hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. Jason studied her carefully. Her armor, once immaculate, now bore scratches and grime from their trek. Her expression, though composed, betrayed traces of uncertainty, a crack in her stoic facade. What changed? Jason asked gently. Why help me? She hesitated, her eyes reflecting the dappled sunlight on the stream. Because you're not the monster I was told to expect. Because, you made me question things I've spent my entire life believing. Jason remained quiet, sensing the vulnerability in her voice. Laraya finally turned to face him, her gaze intense. The Kravik are taught that strength is everything, she continued. We conquer, we dominate, because it is the only way to ensure survival. But you fight for something more. Your people value connection, compassion, even in the face of overwhelming odds. It's unsettling. Jason crossed his arms, leaning casually against a tree. Unsettling enough to make you a fugitive? She smirked, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Apparently. Jason's own smile faded as he considered her predicament. She had risked everything, her rank, her safety, for reasons he still didn't fully understand. Yet, as he stood there, he realized her decision had cost her more than he'd initially thought. "You're brave, you know," he said softly. "Walking away from everything you've ever known, turning your back on your people. That takes guts." Lariah looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face for something. After a moment, she shook her head. "Don't mistake my choices for bravery, Lieutenant. I'm not sure I even know what I'm doing anymore." Jason stepped closer, his voice steady but warm. "You made a choice to help someone you could have left for dead. That counts for something." The air between them shifted, the tension replaced by something warmer, something fragile but real. Lariah held his gaze for a long moment before looking away, her expression softening. "We should move," she said quietly. "The Kravik won't stop hunting us." Jason nodded. "Lead the way." They traveled through dense forest for hours, the alien terrain becoming increasingly treacherous. They scaled jagged rocks, crossed narrow ravines, and waded through murky swamps. Despite the challenges, they worked together seamlessly, their movements becoming more synchronized with each passing mile. When they finally stopped to rest, Jason leaned against a boulder, his chest heaving from exertion. Lariah crouched nearby, scanning their surroundings with her sharp, golden eyes. "You're not used to this kind of terrain, are you?" she asked, a faint note of teasing in her voice. Jason smirked. "Not exactly. Give me a cockpit and a clear target any day." She raised an eyebrow. "And yet you've managed to keep up. Guess I've got more in me than you thought." Lariah's expression shifted, a flicker of respect crossing her face. "Perhaps." They sat in silence for a while, the quiet broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or distant animal calls. Jason watched Lariah out of the corner of his eye, marveling at how composed she seemed despite everything. "Tell me something," he said suddenly, breaking the stillness. "What's it like? Being Kravik, I mean." She glanced at him, her brows furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what drives your people? What do you fight for?" Her expression grew pensive. "The Kravik fight to survive. We are taught from birth that strength is the only truth, that power ensures security. There is no room for weakness or sentiment." Jason frowned. "Sounds lonely." "It is what it must be," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Jason leaned forward, his tone gentler now. "What if it doesn't have to be?" Lariah looked at him, her golden eyes narrowing slightly. "You speak as if your kind has all the answers." "We don't," Jason admitted. "But I know one thing, life's a lot better when you've got someone to share it with." The vulnerability in her gaze deepened, and for a moment, Jason thought she might respond. But she simply stood, brushing dirt from her armor. "We should keep moving," she said briskly, her voice carefully neutral. Jason sighed but didn't argue. As they resumed their journey, he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite her guarded exterior, Lariah was beginning to see the world, and herself, in a new light. Betrayal and redemption. The air grew heavier as Jason and Lariah ventured deeper into the forest, the light dimming under a thick canopy of twisted branches. The tension between them had settled into an uneasy truce, though Jason couldn't shake the sense that something, or someone, was closing in. Lariah suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a silent command. Jason froze, scanning their surroundings. His breath caught when he saw the faint shimmer of movement ahead. Figures emerged from the shadows, their silhouettes unmistakably Kravik. A squad of soldiers, their weapons raised, surrounded them in seconds. Jason's hand went instinctively to his sidearm, but Laria's voice stopped him. "Don't." She stepped forward, raising her hands in a gesture of surrender. The soldiers hesitated, their eyes flicking between her and Jason. One of them, a hulking Kravic male with sharp, angular features, stepped forward. "Commander Laria," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "We were told you'd gone rogue. Is this the human you've been consorting with?" Laria's golden eyes were unreadable as she replied. "I've captured him. He has valuable information about their resistance. I was bringing him back for interrogation." Jason's heart sank, disbelief and betrayal swirling within him. "Laria," he began, but her sharp glance silenced him. "Quiet," she snapped, her voice cold and authoritative. "You're my prisoner now." The Kravic soldier studied her closely, his eyes narrowing. "You've been out of contact for too long, Commander. Command suspects your loyalties have shifted." "I don't answer to your suspicions," Laria said evenly. "I answer to the Vanguard. And I'm completing my mission." The soldier's expression darkened. "Prove it. Execute him." Jason stiffened, his heart pounding. His hand inched toward his weapon, but Laria moved faster. She turned toward him, her plasma blade igniting with a hiss. Jason met her gaze, his breath catching when he saw the silent plea in her eyes. "Trust me," she whispered, so softly the words barely reached him. Before Jason could react, Laria lunged. Her blade slashed downward, but not toward him. Instead, it arced through the air, cutting into the soldier behind him. The Kravic fell with a startled cry, his weapon clattering to the ground. Chaos erupted. The remaining soldiers shouted, their weapons firing in all directions. Laria grabbed Jason's arm, dragging him into the cover of a nearby boulder. "Stay down," she ordered, returning fire with precision. "What the hell are you doing?" Jason shouted over the din. "Saving you," apparently, she shot back, her tone sharp but laced with urgency. She ducked as a plasma bolt scorched the rock beside her. "And probably sealing my fate." Jason didn't have time to process her words. His instincts took over, and he joined the fight, firing at the advancing soldiers. Together, he and Laria moved like a single unit, covering each other as they darted between trees and rocks. Despite their combined efforts, the odds were against them. The Kravic soldiers pressed in, their superior numbers threatening to overwhelm. Jason's weapon beeped in warning, he was out of ammo. He ducked behind a tree, his breath ragged. "Laria," he shouted. "We can't hold them off forever." "I know," she yelled back, her voice strained. She glanced around, her sharp eyes calculating. "Follow me." Jason hesitated, but he had no choice. He bolted after her as she led him toward a narrow ravine. Plasma fire rained down around them, but they managed to reach the edge unscathed. "Jump," Laria said, her voice brooking no argument. Jason looked down at the rocky drop. "You're insane." "Probably," she snapped. "Now go." She shoved him over the edge, and Jason barely managed to control his fall, landing hard on a rocky ledge below. Laria followed, her movements impossibly fluid as she landed beside him. They scrambled into the cover of a small crevice, panting. The sounds of the soldiers faded, replaced by the distant hum of the forest. Jason turned to Laria, his chest heaving with adrenaline and anger. "You lied to them," he said, his voice low and accusing. "And to me." Her golden eyes met his, filled with guilt and determination. "I had no choice. If I hadn't played along, we'd both be dead." Jason stared at her, his emotions warring. "You could have let them take me." "I couldn't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't let them hurt you." Jason's anger softened as he saw the raw emotion in her expression. "Why, Laria? Why risk everything for me? She hesitated, her gaze dropping. Because you've shown me something I didn't think was possible. You've made me believe in something more than survival, something worth fighting for. Jason reached out, his hand resting lightly on her arm. You didn't just save me, Lariah. You chose a different path. That takes courage. Her gaze lifted, meeting his with a vulnerability he hadn't seen before. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. But I know I can't go back. Jason nodded. Then we figure it out together. For the first time, Lariah allowed herself a small, genuine smile. It was brief, but it carried a weight of hope that neither of them could ignore. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for something far more powerful, and far more dangerous. A love that transcends boundaries. Jason and Lariah moved quickly through the dense forest, the distant sound of Kravik patrols growing faint behind them. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the alien landscape in hues of gold and violet. Though their pace was grueling, neither spoke of stopping. They both knew time was against them. Jason glanced at Lariah, her emerald skin glowing faintly in the fading light. She hadn't said much since their escape, but her focus was unwavering. The weight of her decision to betray her people was evident in every measured step, every sharp glance over her shoulder. We're close to the extraction point, Jason said, breaking the silence. His wrist beacon, now fully repaired, displayed coordinates for a small clearing ahead. If we can hold out a little longer, my team will pick us up. Lariah nodded, her expression unreadable. And then what? Jason hesitated, his stride slowing. He hadn't considered what might come after. Would she be safe with his people? Could she even trust them? We'll figure it out, he said finally. Together. Her golden eyes softened for a moment before she returned her gaze to the path ahead. Let's hope your people are as open-minded as you. They reached the clearing just as the first stars began to dot the sky. Jason activated the beacon, its signal pulsing into the night. The faint hum of an approaching ship reached his ears, filling him with a surge of relief. But the moment was short-lived. A low growl echoed through the clearing, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Jason turned to see a group of Kravik soldiers emerging from the shadows, their weapons raised. Lariah stepped in front of Jason, her plasma blade igniting with a sharp hiss. You'll have to go through me, she said, her voice steady despite the odds. The lead soldier sneered. You're a traitor, Lariah. Siding with a human. You disgrace the vanguard. I fight for more than your narrow ideals, Lariah shot back, her blade gleaming in the starlight. Stand down, or you'll regret it. The soldiers charged, and chaos erupted. Lariah moved with precision and grace, her blade slicing through the air in arcs of green light. Jason joined the fray, using the last of his plasma cartridges to take down the nearest attackers. Despite their skill, they were outnumbered, and the Kravik closed in. A blinding spotlight suddenly illuminated the clearing, accompanied by the deafening roar of engines. Jason's extraction team had arrived. A dropship descended, its guns firing at the Kravik, scattering the soldiers and forcing them to retreat into the shadows. Jason grabbed Lariah's arm. Come on. We've got to move. She hesitated, her golden eyes scanning the battlefield. Jason could see the turmoil in her expression, the weight of leaving behind everything she'd ever known. Lariah, he said, his voice urgent but gentle. This is your chance to start over. With me. She looked at him, her gaze searching his face for answers. Then, with a resolute nod, she followed him to the dropship. They climbed aboard as the ramp closed behind them, the roar of the engines drowning out the last shouts of the Kravik soldiers below. The dropship ascended into the atmosphere, leaving the chaos behind. Jason leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving from exertion. Across from him, Lariah sat silently, her gaze fixed on the floor. You did it, Jason said, his voice breaking the quiet. You made it out. Lariah looked up at him, her expression a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. I've left everything behind, she said softly. My people, my purpose. What if I don't belong anywhere now? Jason moved to sit beside her, his voice steady. You belong with me. We'll figure it out together, Lariah. Whatever it takes. Her golden eyes met his, and for the first time, they held something he hadn't seen before, hope. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. Jason took it, his grip firm and reassuring. You've shown me there's more to life than survival, she said. More than strength. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I can't face it without you. Jason smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of relief and something deeper. We'll face it together. The ship docked at a secure outpost hours later. Jason and Lariah stood side by side, the weight of their journey still heavy on their shoulders. The human officers who greeted them were wary, their eyes lingering on Lariah's alien form. Jason stepped forward, his voice firm. This is Commander Lariah. She risked everything to help me. She's one of us now. The officers exchanged uncertain glances but nodded, motioning them forward. Jason felt Lariah's tension ease slightly as they walked together into the facility. That night, as the stars shone brightly over the outpost, Jason and Lariah stood on a quiet balcony overlooking the vast expanse of space. The war was far from over, but in that moment, they found solace in each other. Do you regret it? Jason asked softly, his gaze fixed on the stars. Lariah shook her head, her golden eyes reflecting the distant light. No. For the first time, I feel free. Jason turned to her, his voice filled with quiet conviction. You're not alone anymore. She smiled, a rare and beautiful thing, and took his hand. Neither are you. As they stood together under the endless sky, Jason knew they had found something worth fighting for, something far greater than the war that had brought them together. They had found each other. And that was enough.